The Desert Rose Saloon has seen its share of cruel moments, but none quite like this. A beautiful bride in white, abandoned at the altar because her family deemed her too fat. Her wedding dress still perfect, her heart shattered on the saloon floor. Then walks in Wyatt Mason, the most eligible rancher in the territory. He's never married, never even courted. Some say he's too picky, others say he's married to his ranch. But something about this bride's quiet dignity catches his eye. In a town where appearances mean everything, he's about to do the unthinkable. One decision will challenge every belief these townsfolk hold dear about love, beauty, and worth. But can a marriage born of impulse survive the harsh realities of frontier life? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Clara Bennett stared at her reflection in the pearl-handled mirror. Her mother's last gift before consumption took her 3 winters ago. The glass had a slight crack running through it. Fitting, she thought, as she watched tears track down her cheeks. The morning had started with such promise, the October sun painting Redemption Springs in shades of gold and amber. Her fingers traced the delicate lace of her wedding dress, sewn by her own hands in stolen moments between working at her father's bakery. Every stitch represented a dream, every pearl a prayer. The dress had taken 6 months to complete, and now it felt like a costume in some cruel theatrical performance. "You can't seriously expect Thomas to marry you looking like this," her sister Margaret had sneered just hours ago, pinching at Clara's waist. "You've gotten even bigger since the engagement." Clara had endured the comments about her size all her life, from family, from townspeople, even from her father, who blamed her love of baking for what he called her unfortunate condition. But she'd thought Thomas was different. He'd seemed to appreciate her skills in the kitchen, her way, with numbers as she helped him manage his dry goods store's accounts, her gentle manner with difficult customers. "You're perfect just as you are," he'd said when he proposed, though now Clara wondered if he'd been looking at her father's thriving bakery rather than at her. The Desert Rose Saloon wasn't where she'd imagined spending her wedding day, but it was where Thomas had insisted they hold the ceremony. His family was traveling from back east, he'd explained, and the church was being repaired after the summer storms. Clara had agreed, even though she'd hoped for a proper church wedding. She decorated the saloon herself, transforming the rough-hewn space with white ribbons and wildflowers gathered from the meadow beyond town. Now those same flowers lay crushed beneath hurrying boots as Thomas's family huddled in the corner, whispering and casting horrified glances her way. She hadn't even known they'd arrived early, hadn't known they'd been watching her arrange the last of the flowers, hadn't known they'd cornered Thomas in the back room. "I can't do it," Thomas had announced to the assembled guests, his voice carrying in the sudden silence. "I can't tie myself to... His gesture toward Clara had said everything his words couldn't. Her father, rather than defending her, had simply nodded as if he'd expected this all along. "The girl takes after her mother's side," he'd said to Thomas's parents, as if that explained everything. "Built like draft horses, the lot of them." Clara's fingers tightened around the mirror's handle, remembering her mother's grace, her strength, her ability to make everyone feel welcome and loved. Draft horse indeed. Her mother had been beautiful, inside and out, and had taught Clara that true worth lay in a person's actions, not their appearance. The saloon's bat-wing doors creaked, and Clara tensed, expecting another curious onlooker coming to witness her humiliation. She'd refused to flee when Thomas and his family left, refused to slink away when her own father and sister departed. Something in her, perhaps her mother's spirit, demanded she hold her ground. The heavy tread of boots on wooden planks approached, but Clara kept her eyes on her reflection in the cracked mirror. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry again. Let them look their fill at the too large bride in her handmade dress. Let them whisper and judge. "Miss, The voice was deep, kind, and entirely unfamiliar. Clara turned, the mirror catching the last rays of afternoon sun and throwing rainbow patterns across the saloon's scarred walls. Through her tears, she saw a tall figure silhouetted in the doorway, broad-shouldered and straight-backed. As he stepped into the light, she recognized him. Everyone in 3 counties knew Wyatt Mason by sight, though few could claim to know him well. What she didn't recognize was the look in his eyes as they met hers. Where she expected pity, she found something else entirely. Something that made her heart skip, even as her practical mind warned her not to hope again so soon. Wyatt Mason hadn't intended to stop at the Desert Rose that afternoon. His worn leather ledger, tucked securely in his saddlebag, held figures that demanded attention. Cattle counts, grazing rotations, wage calculations for his ranch hands. He was a man who lived by careful planning, each decision weighed and measured, like the gold dust some still panned for in the creek beds outside town. The sound of whispers had drawn him from his horse. Gathered outside the saloon, townspeople spoke in the hushed tones reserved for scandal and tragedy. Through the windows he'd glimpsed white ribbons and flowers, a wedding, but the mood was all wrong, more like a funeral than a celebration. "Shame about the Bennett girl," old Mrs. Tucker had said, clicking her tongue. But Thomas Whitaker couldn't be expected to, well, you understand. Wyatt did understand, and the understanding sat like bitter coffee in his gut. He'd seen enough of Thomas Whitaker's business practices to know the man's true measure. The kind who smiled while shorting weights and measures, who charged widows full price while offering store credit to pretty young things, who caught his eye. The ledger in Wyatt's saddlebag could attest to that. 2 years ago, he'd caught Whitaker, trying to cheat him on a bulk order of winter supplies. The man had backed down quick enough when confronted, but Wyatt hadn't forgotten. A man's character showed in the small things, his father had always said. Now, standing in the saloon's doorway, Wyatt saw nothing small about this situation. The bride, Clara Bennett, he remembered her from her father's bakery, stood with a quiet dignity that made his chest ache. He'd passed that bakery countless times, savoring the scent of fresh bread and sweet pies. More than once, he'd noticed her efficient movements, her genuine smile, the way she handled difficult customers with grace. "Miss," he heard himself say, though he hadn't planned to speak. When she turned, something shifted in his carefully ordered world. Her eyes, though bright with tears, held no self-pity. The mirror in her hands caught the light, throwing fragments of rainbow across her wedding dress. A dress he could now see was handmade, every stitch speaking of hope and care. Wyatt had spent 15 years building his ranch from nothing, following his father's example of methodical work and careful planning. He'd earned a reputation as a man who never acted without consideration, who could be counted on for sound judgment. Some called him too cautious, too set in his ways. His sister Charlotte, before she'd moved back east, had accused him of hiding behind his ledgers and livestock. "You're afraid of letting anyone close enough to matter," she'd said. "During their last argument, one day you'll look up from those books of yours and realize life's passed you by." The leather ledger seemed to burn against his hip now as he took another step into the saloon. Clara Bennett straightened her shoulders, as if preparing for more judgment, more cruel words. The movement stirred something in him, admiration, anger at those who'd hurt her, and something else he wasn't ready to name. "I don't make decisions lightly, Miss Bennett," he found himself saying, his voice steadier than he felt. "Never have. Every choice I've made has been calculated, considered from all angles." He paused, aware of the curious faces peering through the saloon's windows. "But sometimes I reckon the right choice is clear as spring water, no calculations needed." She looked at him warily, but with a glimmer of something that might have been hope. "Mr. Mason, I've got 300 acres of good grazing land, a herd that's growing every year, and a house that's been needing a woman's touch since my sister moved back east." He took another step forward, removing his hat. "What I don't have is someone to share it with, someone who knows the value of hard work and honest living, Someone who holds their head high when others show their own smallness. The mirror trembled slightly in her hands. Why are you telling me this? Because I'm about to do something completely out of character, Miss Bennet. A smile tugged at his lips. I'm about to make the most impulsive decision of my life, and I'd like you to be part of it. Through the windows, he could see the townspeople gathering, drawn by the unfolding drama. Let them watch. Let them see what real character looked like, wrapped in a handmade wedding dress that couldn't begin to contain the strength within. The saloon-keeper's Bible lay thick with dust in a drawer behind the bar, its leather cover cracked with age. Sam Turner, who'd owned the Desert Rose for 20 years, couldn't remember the last time he'd pulled it out, but now he held it with reverent hands, as if its weight could anchor this surreal moment in reality. "You can't be serious, Wyatt," Joe Henderson called from the doorway, where a crowd had gathered. "This ain't like buying a horse. You can't just—" "I believe I can," Wyatt cut in, his voice carrying the same quiet authority he used to settle. "Spooked cattle. If the lady agrees." Clara's fingers twisted in her wedding dress, her mind spinning. The mirror she'd been clutching now sat on a nearby table, its cracked surface reflecting the afternoon light in fractured beams. This morning, she'd imagined a very different ceremony, with very different eyes watching her. But Thomas's cruel rejection had shattered those dreams like that mirror's surface. Yet here stood Wyatt Mason, a man known for his deliberate nature, his success, his unwavering integrity, offering her something that seemed impossible to trust. "Why?" she managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't even know." "Me. I know enough," Wyatt said, meeting her eyes. "I know you're up before dawn every day to bake the bread this town depends on. I know you handled the bakery's books when your father was laid up with his back last winter. I know you've got more dignity in your little finger than most folks have in their whole body." A murmur ran through the growing crowd. Clara felt her cheeks warm, not from embarrassment this time, but from the simple truth in his words. He had noticed her, had seen her work, her worth, when she thought no one was looking. "But your reputation," she protested weakly. "People will say—" "People always say," he interrupted gently. "Question is, do we give their words power over us?" Sam Turner cleared his throat. "If you're really aiming to do this, might want to do it proper." He opened the Bible, its pages rustling like autumn leaves. "Been a justice of the peace going on 15 years, though most folks forget that part of my duties." More townspeople pressed into the saloon now, drawn by the unfolding drama. Clara caught sight of Mrs. Tucker dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, while next to her, the milliner's wife whispered furiously to her husband. "Miss Bennet," Wyatt said formally, taking off his hat and holding it over his heart. "I know this isn't the wedding day you planned. I know I'm not the man you expected to marry. But I'm offering you a partnership based on respect and honest appreciation of who you are. No more, no less." He paused, then added softly, "The choice is yours." Clara looked around the saloon, at the decorations she'd hung with such hope. That morning, at the curious faces of the townspeople, at Sam Turner with his dusty Bible. Finally, her eyes returned to Wyatt's steady gaze. In it, she saw no pity, no calculation, just a genuine offer, and something that might, with time, grow into more. "Yes," she said, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. "Yes, I'll marry you, Mr. Mason." A collective gasp rose from the onlookers, followed by a buzz of whispers. But Clara barely heard them. She watched as Wyatt's serious expression transformed with a smile that reached all the way to his eyes. "Well then," Sam said, smoothing a wrinkled page, "let's make this official." He raised his voice to carry over the murmuring crowd. "We're gathered here today, in the sight of God and this company." The ceremony that followed was brief but proper. When Wyatt produced a simple gold band from his pocket, his mother's ring, he explained quietly, Clara felt tears spring to her eyes again, but for entirely different reasons than before. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Wyoming," Sam proclaimed finally, "I now pronounce you man and wife." Before he could say another word, Wyatt leaned down and kissed her, gentle but sure. The taste of peppermint and coffee mingled with the salt of her dried tears, and Clara found herself thinking that perhaps some dreams, shattered so better ones, could take their place. As they turned to face the crowd, now applauding with varying degrees of enthusiasm, Clara caught their reflection in the cracked mirror. A tall, solid man and a woman in a handmade wedding dress, both looking somewhat stunned but determined. The beginning of something unexpected, but just maybe, exactly right. The wagon wheel's steady rhythm marked time as they left Redemption Springs behind, each rotation carrying them further from the morning's heartbreak and toward an uncertain future. Clara sat straight-backed on the wagon seat, her wedding dress, catching the late afternoon light. Beside her, Wyatt handled the reins with quiet confidence, giving her the space to gather her thoughts. The silence between them stretched like the shadow of his wagon across the dusty road. Not uncomfortable exactly, but heavy with all the things they didn't know about each other. Clara watched the town shrink behind them, the Desert Rose saloons, sign growing smaller until it was just a glint in the setting sun. "I should tell you," Wyatt said finally, his voice matching the gentle pace of the horses. "The ranch isn't what most would call fancy. It's solid, does its job, but it's been just me and the hands for a while now." Clara smiled slightly, appreciating his honesty. "I grew up over a bakery, Mr. Mason. Fancy isn't something I'm used to." "Wyatt," he corrected softly. "Reckon we should use first names, being married and all?" The word married hung in the air between them, as real and substantial as the gold band on her finger. Clara twisted it absently, feeling its unfamiliar weight. "It was my mother's," Wyatt offered, noticing the gesture. "She'd have liked you, I think. She always said true beauty showed in how a person carried themselves." The wagon hit a rut, jostling them closer together for a moment. Clara caught the scent of leather and clean sweat, mixed with something that might have been peppermint. "Tell me about the ranch," she said, wanting to know more about this man who'd turned her world upside down with a single decision. Wyatt's face softened as he spoke of his land, his voice taking on a warmth she hadn't heard before. He told her about the creek that ran year-round, the meadows that turned purple with wildflowers in spring, the sturdy barn he'd built with his own hands. His words painted a picture of not just a property, but a home built through years of careful work and dedication. "Got 8 hands working for me now," he continued. "Good men, all of them. They bunk in the outer house except for old Pete, who has the room above the stable. He's been with me since the beginning, helps manage things when I'm in town." The sun was setting in earnest now, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Ahead, Clara could make out the shape of buildings against the darkening horizon. As they drew closer, details emerged. A sprawling ranch house with a wide porch, a large barn with fresh paint, neat fencing stretching into the distance. "It's beautiful," she breathed, and meant it. There was something honest about the place, something that spoke of hard work and care. Wyatt drew the wagon to a halt in front of the house. Before he could move, voices called out, and several men appeared from the barn. They approached with curious looks, their eyes moving between Wyatt and Clara with barely concealed surprise. "Boys," Wyatt said, his voice carrying easily in the evening air, "like you to meet Mrs. Mason." The stunned silence that followed was broken by heavy boots on wooden steps. An older man with weathered features emerged from the barn, moving with the careful grace of someone who'd spent a lifetime on horseback. "Well now," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face, "about time you brought some beauty to this place, boss." He touched the brim of his hat. "Pete Wilson, ma'am. Been keeping this one in line for near on 15 years. Clara felt some of her tension ease at the genuine welcome in his voice. "Clara Mason," she replied, the new name feeling strange but not unwelcome on her tongue. Wyatt stepped down from the wagon, then turned to offer her his hand. As Clara took it, preparing to descend in her wedding dress, she caught him looking at her with an expression that made her heart skip. Not passion exactly, but something equally powerful. Recognition, perhaps, of something worthy in her that matched something worthy in him. The moment passed as her feet touched ground, but its warmth lingered. Around them, the ranch hands moved forward to make their introductions, their initial shock giving way to respectful curiosity. Above them, the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, witnesses to this new beginning. The cast-iron cook stove dominated the ranch house kitchen, its black surface reflecting the first light of dawn. Clara stood before it, running her hands along its cool surface, learning its dimensions the way a rider learns their horse. This would be her domain now, so different from the commercial ovens of her father's bakery, yet somehow familiar in its solid presence. "Damn thing's temperamental," Pete had warned her the night before, after showing her where they kept the supplies. "Hot as hell one minute, cold as a banker's heart the next. Most of us just stick to coffee and basic fare." Now, in the quiet morning hours, Clara smiled at the challenge. She'd mastered trickier ovens in her time, though admittedly with more preparation than a sudden marriage had allowed. The wedding dress hung upstairs in the bedroom she now shared with Wyatt, though they'd both awkwardly agreed to give each other time and space, him taking the ranch hand's old quarters down the hall for now. The sound of boots on the porch drew her attention. Wyatt entered, looking surprised to find her up so early. "You didn't have to," he began, but Clara shook her head. "I've been up with the sun since I was 12, she said, already measuring flour into a bowl. "Old habits." He watched her work for a moment, his presence solid but unobtrusive. "The men usually have their breakfast in the bunkhouse. Then it's time they had a proper meal in a proper kitchen," Clara replied, her hands moving with sure confidence as she mixed biscuit dough. "If you could show me where the preserves are kept?" Their eyes met across the kitchen, and something passed between them. Understanding, perhaps, or appreciation. Without a word, Wyatt moved to a lower cabinet and brought out several jars of preserved fruit. "Charlotte, my sister put these up before she left," he explained. "Haven't had the heart to open them." Clara studied the jars, noting the careful work. "She'd want them used," she said softly. "Good preserves are meant to be shared." The morning unfolded with unexpected grace. The temperamental stove proved responsive to Clara's touch, producing golden biscuits and crisp bacon. The smell drew the ranch hands like a dinner bell, their hesitant footsteps on the porch turning confident when Wyatt called them in. "Lord have mercy," Pete breathed, watching Clara set out platters of food on the big kitchen table. "Ain't seen a spread like this since Charlotte left," Wyatt finished, his voice carrying a mix of old pain and new hope. The men ate with the appetite of those who worked hard for their meals, but Clara noticed their manners improving with each bite. They used ma'am more naturally now, and someone had thought to wipe their boots before entering. "Might need to let out my belt if you keep cooking like this, Mrs. Mason," young Tom said, reaching for another biscuit. "Clara," she corrected, gently. "We're family now of a sort." The word family seemed to settle over the kitchen like a warm blanket. Clara saw Wyatt's shoulders relax slightly, saw the men sit a little straighter in their chairs. As the days passed, Clara found her rhythm. The kitchen became her headquarters, but her influence spread throughout the house. She discovered Charlotte's, preserved flowers pressed between Bible pages, carefully framed them, and hung them in the stark hallway. She aired out rooms that had been closed too long, found homes for her few possessions that Pete had retrieved from town, and slowly began to understand the ranch's daily patterns. The men brought her wild berries they found while mending fences, fresh eggs from the chicken coop, even a wayward calf that needed bottle feeding. She repaid them with pies that made them close their eyes in bliss, stews that stuck to their ribs during long days of work, and a listening ear when they needed to talk. Wyatt watched it all with quiet attention. He never interfered when she rearranged things or started new traditions, like afternoon coffee on the porch when the men came in from the fields. Instead, he seemed to take pleasure in the way the house was coming alive again. "You've got a way about you," he said one evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "The place feels different." Clara looked at him sideways. trying to gauge if different was good or bad. Better different, he added, as if reading her mind. Like it was waiting for something and now it's found it. They sat in comfortable silence then, watching the sky paint itself in shades of promise. Clara's hands still smelled of bread and sweet spices, and somewhere in the house, the cast-iron stove ticked as it cooled, marking time in their new shared life. The sound of shattering china cut through the afternoon quiet like a gunshot. Clara stared at the broken pieces of the plate on the kitchen floor, her hands still raised as if holding the ghost of what had slipped from her grasp. It wasn't just any plate. It was one of Charlotte's, part of the set Wyatt's sister had left behind. "Everything all right?" Wyatt's voice came from the doorway, drawn by the noise. Clara knelt to gather the pieces, her movements sharp with frustration. "I was trying to reach the high shelf. If we just rearranged things the way I suggested." "The kitchen's been organized this way for 15 years, Wyatt interrupted, his voice holding an edge she hadn't heard before. "Charlotte had a system." "Charlotte isn't here anymore," Clara said, then immediately wished she could take back the words as she saw Wyatt's expression harden. "No," he said quietly, "she isn't, and maybe that's something we need to discuss." Clara stood, fragments of china cradled in her apron. "What do you mean?" "I mean that ever since you arrived, you've been changing things. Moving furniture, altering routines, reorganizing everything from the pantry to the tack room, because some of these systems don't make sense. The cooking pots are stored too far from the stove, the preserves are scattered across 3 different shelves, and don't get me started on the way the ledgers are kept." The ledgers, that was the real heart of it, they both knew. Clara had found the ranch's accounting books in disarray, despite Wyatt's careful nature. Charlotte's system, while well-intentioned, had been needlessly complicated. "Those ledgers kept this ranch running for years," Wyatt said, his voice tight, "and they could work better. I managed my father's books since I was 16. I know how to—" "This isn't your father's bakery," Wyatt cut in. "This is a working cattle ranch, and things are done a certain way for a reason." Clara set the broken pieces on the counter with deliberate care. "And what way is that exactly? The way your sister did them, the way they've always been done, or the way that actually makes sense?" They stood facing each other across the kitchen, the broken plate between them, like a line drawn in sand. Through the window, Clara could see Pete and young Tom pausing in their work, clearly aware of the tension in the main house. "I didn't marry you to replace Charlotte," Wyatt said finally. "No," Clara replied, her voice softening slightly. "You married me because you saw someone worth partnering with. At least that's what you said at the Desert Rose. Was that true? Wyatt, did you mean it when you said you wanted a partnership?" The question hung in the air between them. Wyatt ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Clara had come to recognize as a sign of internal struggle. "Of course I meant it," he said. "But partnership doesn't mean throwing away everything that came before." "No," Clara agreed. "It means building something new together, using the best of what was and what could be." She picked up a piece of the broken plate, turning it in her hands. "Like this china. It's beautiful, but keeping it too high to reach safely doesn't honor Charlotte's memory. It just ensures that eventually every piece will end up broken." Wyatt moved closer, taking the fragment from her hands and studying it. "She always did say these plates were meant to be used, not just displayed." He sighed, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "I reckon I've been holding on to more than just china." Clara reached out, tentatively touching his arm. "I'm not trying to erase Charlotte. I just want to find my own place here, to contribute in ways that I know I can." "The ledgers really are a mess, aren't they?" A reluctant smile tugged at his lips. "Terrible," Clara agreed, daring to smile back. "But fixable, like most things, if you're willing to try something new." Wyatt looked around the kitchen, seeing it perhaps through fresh eyes. "Show me," he said finally. "Show me how you'd organize. In things, how you'd keep the books, not because it's better than Charlotte's way, but because it might be better for us now." Clara felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. "We could start with the preserves," she suggested. Move them, where we can both reach them easily. Together. Wyatt nodded, and in that one word, Clara heard the beginning of true partnership. Outside, the ranch hands returned to their work, satisfaction evident in their movements. Inside, a husband and wife began the delicate task of building something new from the pieces of what came before. The letter arrived with Pete's regular supply run to town, its crisp envelope carrying Clara's sister's precise handwriting. Margaret's words were like paper cuts, sharp and deliberately painful. "Father is beside himself with worry. How could you embarrass us this way? Marrying a stranger, abandoning the bakery, bringing shame to our family name." Clara stood on the porch, the letter trembling in her hands, when the sound of approaching horses made her stomach clench. Even before the riders came into view, she knew, the same way prey animals know when predators are near. "Clara?" Wyatt appeared beside her, reading the tension in her posture. "What is it?" "They're coming," she whispered, just as her father's wagon rounded the bend, Margaret's parasol visible beside him like a soldier's banner. Wyatt's hand found the small of her back, warm and steady. "Remember," he said quietly, "this is your home now. You don't have to prove anything to anyone." But old habits die hard, and Clara felt herself shrinking as her father's wagon drew closer. The critical voice in her head, the one that sounded so much like Margaret, started its familiar litany. "Stand straighter, smile prettier, be smaller, be better, be different. Clara Rose Bennett." Her father's voice boomed across the yard. "What in God's name were you thinking?" "Mason," Wyatt corrected, his tone pleasant but firm. "Clara Rose Mason is my wife's name now." Margaret sniffed as she descended from the wagon, her traveling dress immaculate despite the dusty road. Hardly a proper wedding, from what we heard. "A saloon ceremony? Really, Clara? How could you? The same way you could leave me standing." "They're alone," Clara replied, surprising herself with her steadiness. "One choice at a time. Now see here," her father blustered, but Wyatt stepped forward, his presence somehow filling the porch. "Mr. Bennett, Mrs." He paused, looking at Margaret. "Miss," she corrected primly. "Unlike some, I haven't rushed into an ill-considered marriage. Miss Bennett, then." Wyatt's voice remained measured. "You've had a long ride. Perhaps we should continue this discussion inside, where Clara's fresh-baked bread and coffee might smooth the way for civil conversation." Clara shot him a grateful look. He'd noted her stress baking this morning, the way she'd channeled her anxiety into creating something nurturing. Now he was turning it into a shield, using her strength to protect her. Inside, the kitchen told its own story. Loaves of bread cooled on the counter, their golden crusts testament to Clara's skill. The reorganized shelves gleamed with preserved fruits and vegetables, Charlotte's china displayed at accessible heights. Every surface spoke of care and competence. Margaret's eyes darted around, gathering ammunition. "I see you've taken over." "Completely," she said, "rearranging everything to suit yourself." "Actually," Wyatt interjected, "those changes were my idea. Clara's system makes more sense for a working ranch kitchen." The lie, small, kind, protective, wrapped around Clara. Like a warm shawl, she busied herself with coffee preparations, letting the familiar routine steady her hands. "The bakery's suffering without you," her father said, accepting a cup. "Customers ask daily when you'll return to your senses and come home." "I am home," Clara replied, and meant it. "The bakery was your dream, Father, just as Thomas was your choice for my husband, and Margaret was your perfect daughter. I never—" he began, but Clara continued, her voice gaining strength. "I've found my own dream here. A partnership based on respect, not criticism. A home where I'm valued, not despite who I am, but because of it." Wyatt moved to stand beside her, their shoulders touching. The contact grounded her, reminded her of who she'd become in these past weeks. "I'll always be your daughter," she told her father softly. "But I'm also Mrs. Mason now, mistress of this ranch, and happy in ways I never knew I could be." The silence that followed felt like a held breath. Margaret's face showed the kind of shock usually reserved for improper behavior at church socials. Their father stared into his coffee cup as if it might hold answers to questions he'd never thought to ask. Finally, he looked up, seeing perhaps for the first time the woman his daughter had become. "The bread," he said gruffly, "is better than what we've been serving at the bakery." It wasn't an apology or even acceptance, not really, but it was a beginning, a small crack in the wall of judgment that had surrounded Clara all her life. She felt Wyatt's quiet pride beside her and stood, straighter, ready to build on that beginning, one choice at a time. Market day in Redemption Springs dawned grey and unseasonably cold for early autumn. Clara sat beside Wyatt in the wagon, a carefully wrapped hand-stitched quilt on her lap, her first real project since coming to the ranch. She'd worked on it, during quiet evenings, piecing together scraps of fabric into something both beautiful and useful. "You don't have to do this," Wyatt said softly as they approached town. "The hands can handle the supply run." Clara squared her shoulders. "A mason doesn't hide," she replied, using his own words from the night before. "Besides, the quilting circle meets today. Your sister's friends have been kind enough to invite me." The town looked different now, less threatening than it had on her abandoned wedding day. Still, whispers followed their wagon down Main Street, and Clara caught more than one person pointing in their direction. "Well, if it isn't the happy couple," Mrs. Tucker called from the mercantile's porch, but her usual sharp tone held a note of curiosity. "Heard you've been making changes up at the Mason place, Clara." "Some," Clara acknowledged, climbing down from the wagon with the quilt in her arms. "Though mostly I've just been learning the ways of ranch life." "That's not what I heard," came another voice, and Clara turned to see Sarah Williams, the doctor's wife, approaching. "Pete Wilson was telling everyone how you've transformed the place. Says the men haven't eaten so well since Charlotte left." Before Clara could respond, a commotion erupted from the doctor's office down the street. Dr. Williams burst out, his face grave. "Sarah, the Henderson children, all 4 down with fever. The Cooper's kids, too, need you to—" "How many?" Sarah asked, already moving. 8 so far, maybe more coming. This fever's spreading fast among the little ones." Clara looked at her quilt, then at Wyatt. He nodded slightly, understanding in his eyes. "Mrs. Williams," Clara called, "would a clean, warm quilt be helpful? And perhaps some bone broth?" Sarah turned, relief flooding her features. "The quilt. Yes, we need everything we can get. But the broth, I haven't time to—" "I'll make it," Clara said firmly. "Enough for all the sick children and their families." Whispers rippled through the growing crowd. Clara heard someone mention Thomas's name, followed by "Lucky Escape" and "Blessing in Disguise." "I'll need the kitchen at the Desert Rose," she continued, ignoring the whispers. "Sam Turner's got the biggest stove in town, and I'll need help. Every pot and chicken we can find." To her surprise, Mrs. Tucker stepped forward. "My boys can gather the chickens, and I've got 2 good pots at home." Other women joined in, offering vegetables, herbs, thyme. Even Margaret, who happened to be in town that day, volunteered her carefully maintained copper pot. The Desert Rose's kitchen transformed into a command center. Clara directed operations, with the same quiet efficiency she'd shown at the ranch, delegating tasks, organizing supplies, keeping the massive pots of broth simmering at perfect temperature. "Just like old times," Sam commented, watching her taste and adjust seasonings. "Though I recall you used to be more hesitant about giving orders." Clara paused, realizing he was right. The woman who had stood trembling in a wedding dress would never have commandeered his kitchen or organized half the town's women into a broth-making brigade. "Marriage suits you," he added with a wink, before heading back to the bar to coordinate. More supply deliveries. Throughout the day, reports came in. The broth was helping, keeping the sick children hydrated, giving strength to worried parents who'd forgotten to eat. Clara's quilt, along with others donated by the quilting circle, kept little bodies warm as the fever broke. By sunset, the crisis had passed. Dr. Williams reported all the children improving, though he kept the quilt for his youngest patients. "You've likely prevented this from becoming a tragedy," he told Clara as she cleaned the last pot. "Good bone broth's better than half the medicines I stock." Wyatt found her there, wiping down Sam's kitchen to his exacting standards. He'd spent the day helping transport supplies and families, their wagon becoming an impromptu ambulance. "Ready to head home?" he asked softly. Clara looked around the kitchen, at the women who now smiled at her with respect rather than judgment, at Sam who'd trusted her with his domain, at the town that had come together under her guidance. "Yes," she said, taking Wyatt's arm. "Let's go home." They left town different from how they'd arrived. The whispers still followed, but they spoke now of capability rather than scandal, of blessing rather than shame. Clara sat tall beside her, husband understanding finally that acceptance, like love, sometimes comes in unexpected ways. The broken fence post had been cut, not snapped by weather or beast. Wyatt crouched in the pre-dawn light, his fingers tracing the clean angle of the saw marks, while Pete and Tom stood watch, rifles ready. "Third breach this week," Pete said, grimly. "Getting bolder, whoever they are." Clara watched from Thunder, the gentle mare Wyatt had been teaching her to ride. She'd insisted on coming along for the fence check after yesterday's discovery of missing cattle. The ranch hands had protested, rustlers were no business for a woman, but Wyatt had simply helped her mount up, understanding her need to face their troubles together. "They're professionals," Wyatt said, standing. "These cuts are precise. They know exactly how to take down a section without making noise." He looked at the tracks leading away from the fence. "And they know our patrol schedule." "Someone's feeding them information," Clara said quietly. The men turned to her, surprised by her insight. "The cuts are always in places where the cattle drift naturally. They're not just taking random animals, they're choosing the prime steers, the ones ready for market." Wyatt's eyes met hers with dawning understanding. "You've been studying the ledgers and watching the herd movements from the kitchen window while I work." She nodded. "The rustlers never hit the same section twice. They know which cattle are where and when." "Has to be someone in town," Tom offered. "Someone who deals with the ranch regular-like." Clara dismounted, moving to examine the tracks herself. The ground told a story, if you knew how to read it. "Look here," she pointed. "Wagon tracks, but they're strange." Wyatt knelt beside her. "The left wheel's wobbly, leaves a distinctive pattern. Like the supply wagon from Turner's Mercantile," Clara said. "The one driven by his new hand, the man who always asks so many questions about our operation when he makes deliveries." A heavy silence fell over the group. Sam Turner was a friend, but his new hired man, James Cooper, had arrived in town just before the rustling began. "We can't accuse someone without proof," Wyatt said finally. "And if we spook them now, they'll just run, maybe hit another ranch instead." "Then we need to catch them in the act," Clara replied, her mind working through possibilities. "And I think I know how." That evening, over coffee in the kitchen, Clara spread out the ledgers. She'd been keeping them meticulously since taking over from Charlotte's system, but now she made deliberate changes, subtle enough to look natural, obvious enough to be found by prying eyes. "If Cooper's their inside man, he'll see these records. When he makes his delivery tomorrow," she explained, "they'll show our best cattle being moved to the north pasture for winter grazing. But we'll actually move them south," Wyatt finished, catching her plan, "and be waiting at the north fence line when they come." Clara nodded. "They'll be expecting an easy raid. Most of the hands in town for supplies, the cattle far from the house, a dark moon for cover." Wyatt studied her face in the lamplight. "It's risky. If they realize it's a trap, everything worth having carries risk," she said softly, echoing his words from their wedding day. The next night found them hiding near the north fence line, the cold ground seeping through their clothes. Clara had insisted on being there, and again Wyatt had understood. This was their home, their livelihood, their future. They would defend it together. The rustlers came just before midnight, their wagon's distinctive wobble giving them away. In the darkness, Clara heard the quiet sounds of men with evil intentions, the snick of a saw against wood, the muffled curse as someone stumbled. Then Wyatt's voice rang out clear and commanding, "That's far enough, Cooper." Light flared as Pete and Tom lit the hidden lanterns. The rustlers found themselves surrounded, rifles trained on them from all sides. Cooper's face showed shock before twisting into anger. "Should have known it was too easy," he spat. "The fat baker's daughter turned out to have a brain." "My wife," Wyatt corrected coldly, "has more than a brain. She has my complete trust. Something. You'll have time to think about in territorial prison." Later, after the sheriff had taken Cooper and his gang away, Clara and Wyatt stood by the broken fence post. The first light of dawn painted the sky in shades of promise. "Need to put in a new post," Wyatt said, but made no move to start. "Need to put in a lot of things," Clara replied, "but we've got time." He turned to her then, really looked at her. "You know, when I married you, I thought I was offering you protection. Never occurred to me you'd end up protecting all of us." Clara smiled, touching the rough wood of the broken post. "That's what partners do. They fill in each other's broken places until something stronger grows." Above them, the morning star faded into daylight, watching over a ranch where trust, like love, had put down deep roots. The lightning-struck oak stood like a wounded sentinel against the bruised sky, its newly split trunk a testament to nature's raw power. Clara watched from the porch as the storm built in the west, massive clouds towering like mountains over the prairie. The air felt strange, too thick, too still, carrying the metallic taste of approaching danger. "Never seen the sky that color," Pete said, coming up beside her. His weathered face showed the concern he was trying to hide. "Like a bad bruise." The wind picked up suddenly, hot and wrong, carrying bits of debris and the distant smell of rain. From the pastures came the nervous lowing of cattle, sensing the oncoming storm. "Where's Wyatt?" Clara asked, scanning the horizon. "Went to check the west herd with Tom. Should have been back by now." As if summoned by their worry, two riders appeared in the distance, moving fast. But even as Clara's heart lifted at the sight of her husband, she saw what he was racing against, a wall of dust and rain, reaching from earth to sky. "Get everyone to the storm cellar!" Wyatt shouted as they thundered into the yard. "This one's bad." Clara was already moving. "The cattle!" "No time to get them all to shelter," he called back, dismounting in a fluid motion. "Have to trust they'll follow their instincts, find the low ground." Rain began to fall, fat drops that hit like bullets. The wind rose to a scream, and Clara saw items starting to fly, branches, loose tools, someone's forgotten hat cartwheeling across the yard. "The horses!" Tom yelled over the wind. "Can't leave them in the barn if it goes bad." Wyatt nodded grimly. "Clara, get to the cellar with Pete and the others." "No," she said, surprising herself with her firmness. "You'll need every hand." Their eyes met in the strange stormlight. In his, she saw worry warring with respect, protection battling partnership. In the end, trust won. "Stay close," he ordered, and together they ran for the barn. Inside, the horses were wild-eyed with fear, picking up on the storm's violence. Clara moved down the line with Wyatt and Tom, releasing gates, removing halters, guiding panic-stricken animals toward the entrance, where Pete waited to herd them toward the sheltered valley. A massive thunderclap shook the barn. Clara heard wood groan ominously above them. "That's the last one," Tom shouted. "We need to—" The rest of his words were lost as something huge slammed into the barn's side. Clara felt Wyatt's arms around her, pulling her down and under the shelter of an empty stall as part of the roof tore away. They huddled there, pressed together as the storm raged. Clara could feel Wyatt's heart hammering against her back, his breath warm on her neck. Despite the chaos around them, she felt oddly safe, anchored by his presence. "Should have made you go to the cellar," he said, close to her ear, his voice torn by wind. Clara turned in his arms, facing him in the dim light. I'm exactly where I need to be. Something shifted in his expression then, something that had been building since the day they met. Later, Clara would remember their first real kiss tasting, of rain and risk, of trust given and earned. Around them the storm howled its fury, but in that moment they found shelter in each other. The storm passed as summer storms do, leaving destruction and renewal in its wake. When they finally emerged from the barn, the world seemed washed clean. The lightning-struck oak had fallen completely, but already its exposed roots reached for soil, proving that even broken things could find new ways to grow. They worked together to assess the damage, Clara's practical nature complementing Wyatt's experience. The barn would need repairs. Fences had fallen, and they'd lost some cattle to the storm. But the house stood firm, and in the valley where Pete had guided them, the horses grazed peacefully with most of the herd. As sunset painted the storm clouds in gentler colors, Clara and Wyatt stood by the fallen oak. His arm rested comfortably around her waist, a touch that felt as natural, now as breathing. "Could have lost everything," he said quietly. "But we didn't," Clara replied, leaning into him. "We faced it together." "Together," he echoed, and kissed her again, softer this time, sweeter. Above them, the evening star emerged from clearing. Skies, blessing a love that had weathered its first storm and grown stronger in the breaking. The blue ribbon seemed to mock Clara from its perch on the judge's table, its silk edges fluttering in the autumn breeze. She'd seen countless such ribbons displayed in her father's bakery window over the years, awards he'd won while taking credit for her recipes. Now, standing before her own entry in the Harvest Fair's baking competition, she fought the urge to withdraw. "Never seen a pie quite like that," Mrs. Tucker commented, peering at Clara's creation. The older woman had stopped calling her the Mason boy's impulsive bride weeks ago, but her tone still carried traces of doubt. Clara touched the carefully latticed crust of her signature apple honey pie, a recipe she'd perfected during long nights at the ranch. "It's made with honey from our new hives," she explained, "the ones Wyatt helped me set up after the storm." The memory brought a smile to her face. He'd approached her idea of keeping bees with the same thoughtful consideration. He gave all their ventures, then thrown himself into the project with surprising enthusiasm. "A ranch wife who thinks like a rancher," he'd said proudly, when her explanation of better pollination for their kitchen garden had led to increased yields in the nearby pastures. The fair grounds buzzed with activity around them. Children darted between display tables, their faces sticky with candy. Farmers compared crops and livestock, while their wives competed in various domestic arts. Through the crowd, Clara caught glimpses of Thomas Whitaker glad-handing his way among the merchants' stalls, his new wife, thin as a rake and half his age, trailing behind him. "Clara," she turned to find Wyatt approaching, his expression warming as he took in her display. He'd been occupied with the livestock competitions all morning, showing their prize bull. The silver belt buckle he wore spoke of his own success. "Your father's here," he said quietly, brought his usual sourdough entry. Clara nodded, unsurprised. The Bennett Bakery had won the bread category 5 years running. Her recipes, his name on the awards. "Good," she said, straightening her spine. "It's time he learned where those winning recipes really came from." Wyatt's hand found the small of her back, offering silent support. Over the months of their marriage, touch had become their own language. Comfort, encouragement, and love expressed in these small connections. The judges approached, led by Reverend Gardner's wife, whose opinion carried weight in all things domestic. They moved methodically down the row of entries, tasting, discussing, making notes in their little books. When they reached Clara's pie, she held her breath. Mrs. Gardner's eyebrows rose at the first bite. "Interesting," she said, taking another. "Taste. The honey adds complexity without overwhelming the apples. And this crust," she turned to her fellow judges. "Ladies?" Clara watched their faces as they sampled her work. She'd learned to read people during her years in the bakery, the slight widening of eyes that signaled surprise, the unconscious nod that accompanied pleasure. "Well," Mrs. Gardner said finally, "I believe we've found our winner." Movement in the crowd drew Clara's attention. Her father stood watching, his face unreadable as Mrs. Gardner picked up the blue ribbon. Behind him, Thomas Whitaker had stopped his glad-handing to stare. "Mrs. Mason," Mrs. Gardner announced formally, "your pie represents everything we look for in this competition: creativity, skill, and a deep understanding of your ingredients. The use of local honey shows true connection to your land and community." Clara accepted the ribbon with steady hands, its silk as smooth as promise against her fingers. She felt Wyatt's quiet pride beside her, heard the genuine applause from the crowd. "Thank you," she said clearly. "My mother taught me that good baking, like a good life, requires both courage and care. You have to know when to follow tradition." She met her father's eyes across the crowd, and when to trust your own heart. Later, after the crowds had thinned and the evening light painted the fairgrounds gold, her father approached. He stood looking at her display for a long moment before speaking. "Your mother's honey cake recipe," he said gruffly. "The one I could never quite get right. Would you share it?" Clara heard the question behind the question, the acknowledgement and the apology wrapped in simple words. "Yes," she said softly. "I'll write it down for you. Properly this time, with all the details." He nodded once, then turned to Wyatt. "You'll bring her by the bakery." "If she wishes," Wyatt replied, his hand finding its home against Clara's. Back once more, they watched her father walk away, his shoulders less rigid than before. The blue ribbon caught the last light of day, transformed from a symbol of competition into something more, a bridge between past and present, a mark of growth, a testament to finding one's own path. "Ready to head home?" Wyatt asked, though they both knew he'd wait as long as she needed. Clara touched the ribbon one last time, then smiled. "Yes, let's go home." The doctor's bag sat ominously on the kitchen table, its worn leather containing both hope and fear. Clara watched Dr. Williams examine Wyatt's leg, her hands clenched in her apron to keep from reaching out. The cattle drive had been going smoothly, until a spooked steer charged, catching Wyatt between itself and a rock face. "Clean break," the doctor pronounced finally, "but he'll need complete rest for at least 6 weeks. No riding, no walking without crutches, and absolutely no working." Wyatt's face darkened. "The autumn drive can't wait 6 weeks. We've got contracts to fulfill, cattle to move before the weather turns. Then they'll have to be fulfilled without you," Dr. Williams said firmly, pulling supplies from his bag. "Unless you fancy losing that leg entirely." Clara stepped forward, her mind already working through the logistics. "Pete knows the trails as well as you do. Tom and the others can handle the physical work, and I can manage the books, the contracts, the supply orders." "It's not that simple," Wyatt started, but Clara met his eyes steadily. "No, it's not simple. But neither was marrying a stranger in a saloon. Neither was facing down rustlers or surviving that storm. We've handled everything else together. We'll handle this too." After the doctor left, Clara helped Wyatt settle in their bedroom, his splinted leg propped on pillows. He caught her hand as she turned to leave. "The men won't want to take orders from a woman," he said quietly. Clara smiled, remembering how far they'd all come since those first uncertain days. "Then it's good thing they've had months to practice, isn't it?" The next morning found her in the barn before dawn, reviewing the drive plans with Pete. The old foreman treated her with the same respect he showed Wyatt, marking potential routes on the map and explaining his concerns. "Main thing is keeping the herd moving steady," he explained. "Too fast, they lose weight. Too slow, we risk early snow in the passes." Clara nodded, seeing the journey in her mind. "We'll send Tom ahead to check the water sources, just like Wyatt planned. And I want daily reports, someone riding back at sunset to update us on progress." "Us?" Pete's eyebrows rose. "I'll be staying here to manage the ranch and care for—" "Wyatt," Clara confirmed, "but I need to know everything. Every decision, every challenge, every change of plan. These cattle represent contracts I'll be responsible for fulfilling." Word spread through the hands. Mrs. Mason was taking charge. Clara caught snippets of conversation, saw the weighing looks cast her way, but she also saw the nods of approval. When she demonstrated knowledge of their operations, when she spoke confidently about grazing rotations and market prices, the drive departed at first light the next day. Clara stood on the porch, watching dust rise from thousands of hooves. Part of her wanted to ride with them, to see firsthand that everything went smoothly, but her place was here, balancing the needs of her injured husband with the demands of running the ranch. She developed a routine, mornings spent checking on Wyatt and managing correspondence with buyers, afternoons overseeing the remaining hands as they prepared the ranch for winter, evenings reading Pete's reports by lamplight, marking the herd's progress on maps, while Wyatt offered insights from his bed. "You're doing more than managing," he said one night, watching her update the ledgers. "You're leading." Clara paused, ink hovering over paper. "I learned from the best." "No," he shook his head. "You already knew how. You just needed someone to see it." The weeks passed in a blur of activity. Clara negotiated with buyers, arranged supply deliveries, and kept the ranch running smoothly. When an early snowstorm threatened the high passes, she made the call to redirect the herd through longer but safer routes, trusting Pete to execute her decision. Finally, word came that the drive had reached its destination successfully. Every contract fulfilled, every head of cattle accounted for. Clara sat beside Wyatt's bed, reading Pete's final report aloud. "Mrs. Mason's judgment about the snow proved right," she read. "Saved us considerable trouble. Reckon we're lucky to have 2 good heads running things now instead of just 1. Wyatt reached for her hand, his grip strong despite weeks of forced rest. "They finally figured out what I've known since that day in the saloon. You're not just my wife, you're my true partner." Clara laced her fingers through his, feeling the calluses that matched her own newfound ones. Outside their window, autumn painted the prairie in golds and reds, promising that even seasons of challenge held their own kind of beauty. The handmade scarf draped across Clara's lap, her fingers working the soft yarn with practiced ease as snow fell beyond the windows. She'd learned to knit from her mother, though she'd rarely had time for it at the bakery. Now, winters enforced. Stillness gave her hours to create things of beauty and warmth. Wyatt sat nearby in his favorite chair, his healing leg propped on a footstool. The fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the world had disappeared under feet of snow, turning the ranch into an island of warmth. In a sea of white. "Tell me something I don't know about you," Clara said, her needles clicking softly. They'd started this game during the first week of being snowed in, sharing pieces of themselves to pass the long evenings. Wyatt was quiet for a moment, watching her hands move. "I used to write poetry," he admitted finally. "Bad poetry, mind you, but I filled notebooks with it when I was younger." Clara's needles stilled. "What kind of poetry?" "The usual young man's thoughts. Nature, life, love." He smiled self-consciously. "Charlotte found one of my old notebooks last year, threatened to read it at Sunday Social." "Is that why she moved back east?" Clara teased, enjoying the rare sight of her husband's embarrassment. "Might have had something to do with it," he chuckled. "Your turn. Tell me something I don't know." Clara resumed her knitting, considering. "I once entered a pie in the county fair under a false name," she said, "just to prove I could win without my father's reputation behind me." "Did you?" "First prize." She smiled at the memory. Father was furious that some unknown cook had beaten him. Never did tell him it was me. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. Clara found herself grateful for the storm that had given them this time together, forced them to truly know each other beyond the roles of husband and wife, rancher and partner. "I was engaged once before," Wyatt said suddenly, his voice quiet. "Years ago, before I bought this place, She couldn't see the potential in a rundown ranch, and a man with big dreams chose a banker instead. Clara set down her knitting, moved by the old hurt in his voice. "Her loss," she said softly. "Worked out for the best," he replied, reaching for her hand. "Led me to that day in the saloon, to you." Their fingers intertwined, warm against the winter chill. Clara thought about fate and choices, about how life's disappointments sometimes cleared the path for something better. "I used to pray to be different," she confessed, "to be more like Margaret, thin and proper and perfect. Even after Mother told me I was beautiful just as I was, even after I learned to take pride in my skills, part of me still believed being bigger meant being less." Wyatt tugged gently on her hand, drawing her from her chair to his lap, mindful of his healing leg. "You've never been less," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You're more than I ever dreamed of finding." She settled against him, feeling the steady beat of his heart. "Even when I rearrange your sister's kitchen, or argue about cattle prices, or take over your ranch while you're laid up? Especially then." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Though I'm still not sure about moving the preserves to the lower shelves." Clara laughed, the sound bright in the firelit room. "Charlotte would approve. She left me a letter, you know. Pete brought it last week with the mail." Wyatt stilled. "What did she say?" "That she's been wanting to visit but wasn't sure how. I'd feel about it. That she's heard good things about how we're running the ranch. That she's glad her brother finally found someone who matches him stride for stride." The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, the storm continued its assault, but in here they were safe, warm, complete. "We should invite her for spring," Wyatt said. "Show her how we've made this place our own." Clara reached for her knitting again, adding another row to what would become Wyatt's scarf. "I'd like that. She can help us plant the new garden I've been planning." "Already thinking of spring?" "Always," she smiled. "Mother used to say winter was for dreaming up the future while keeping faith in what you couldn't see, like seeds under snow or love growing in unexpected places." Wyatt's arms tightened around her. Together they watched the fire dance and the snowfall, two people who had found in each other not just love, but understanding, not just partnership, but completion. The scarf grew longer under Clara's fingers, a tangible symbol of warmth created stitch by patient stitch. Just as their love had grown moment by moment, choice by choice. Clara knelt in the freshly turned earth, a packet of garden seeds cradled in her palm like precious gems. The spring air carried the scent of possibility, of green things waiting to burst into life. Behind her, Wyatt worked with Pete and Tom to expand the garden plot, their shovels rhythmically breaking new ground. "Reckon this is the biggest kitchen garden the ranch has ever seen," Pete commented, pausing to wipe his brow. "Gonna need more hands to tend it all?" Clara smiled, carefully placing seeds in the furrows she'd drawn. "Good thing we're hiring then. 3 new families coming next week. 2 for the North Pasture operation, 1 specifically for the garden and new orchard." The expansion had been her idea, born during those long winter evenings of planning with Wyatt. Why not use some of their water-rich bottomland to grow more than just cattle feed? The territory needed fresh produce as much as beef, and diversifying would protect them against lean years. "My practical wife," Wyatt had said admiringly when she'd shown him the figures, always thinking ahead. Now he stopped his digging to watch her work, his face soft with something that made Clara's heart skip even after all these months. His leg had healed strong, letting him return to full duties just as spring arrived. But their time of forced closeness had changed them both, deepened their connection in ways that showed in small moments like this. "Got another letter from Charlotte," he called. "Says she'll be here next week, in time to help with the planting." Clara sat back on her heels, pleasure warming her chest. "Good. I want her opinion on the new preserving kitchen we're adding. And she can help me plan the wineberry patch." The idea of wineberries had come from one of Charlotte's old notebooks, a failed experiment she'd never had time to properly develop. Clara intended to succeed where her sister-in-law had left off, adding another product to their growing list of innovations. "You Mason women and your schemes," Pete chuckled. "Between you and Charlotte, this place'll be more than just a cattle ranch before long." "That's the idea," Clara replied, rising to survey their work. The new garden plot stretched impressive and promising, ready to nurture the seeds of change she and Wyatt had planned all winter. Young Tom approached leading. A wagon, the supply delivery from town. But instead of just feed and basic necessities, this wagon carried lumber for the new preserving kitchen, glass jars for this summer's harvest, and saplings for the orchard they'd start next week. "Heard talk in town," Tom said as he helped unload. "Other ranches asking about our plans. Some folks saying we're foolish to split our attention from cattle. Some folks said I was foolish to marry a stranger in a saloon," Clara responded serenely. "Sometimes the best decisions look foolish to those who lack vision." Wyatt came up beside her, his hand finding its familiar place at the small of her. "Back. Speaking of vision, brought you something from town yesterday." From his pocket, he produced a small package wrapped in brown paper. Clara opened it to find a new seed catalogue, its pages filled with exotic varieties she'd only dreamed of trying. "I thought you might want to plan next year's garden," he said. "Dream even bigger." Clara leafed through the catalogue, ideas already blooming in her mind. "We'll need to expand the root cellar," she mused. "Maybe add a greenhouse for winter growing." "Already ordered the glass," Wyatt replied with a grin. "Should arrive next month." She looked at him in surprise. Despite their partnership, his willingness to support her ideas still amazed her sometimes. "What?" he asked, catching her expression. "You're not the only one who can plan ahead, Mrs. Mason." Around them, the ranch hummed with purpose. Pete and Tom had moved on to marking the orchard boundaries. The new garden waited for its seeds, rich soil ready to nurture whatever they planted. Soon, Charlotte would arrive, bringing her own ideas to add to their growing dreams. Clara slipped the catalogue into her pocket and reached for another packet of seeds. These were special ones. Flowers her mother had loved, saved and replanted year after year. She'd tend them beside the herbs and vegetables, adding beauty to practicality, just as love had added depth to their marriage of convenience. "Ready to plant the future?" Wyatt asked softly. Clara nodded, taking his hand. Together they knelt. In the warm earth, two people who had found in each other not just love, but the courage to grow something new from unexpected beginnings. The family Bible lay open on the kitchen table, its pages turned to the record section, where generations of births, deaths, and marriages were inscribed in varying hands. Clara traced the newest entry, her marriage to Wyatt, written in Pete's. Careful script on that strange day at the Desert Rose Saloon. Below it, space waited for future editions, future stories yet to be told. The sound of wagons approaching drew her attention. Through the window, she saw two vehicles coming up the drive, Charlotte in the first and, to her surprise, her father and sister in the second. "They actually came," she murmured. The invitation to visit had been Wyatt's idea, sent after her. Father's tentative overtures at the harvest fair. Clara hadn't really expected them to accept. Wyatt appeared beside her, sensing her tension. "Want me to send them away?" She squeezed his hand, grateful for the offer, but knowing it was time to face this. No, some things need to be faced, head on. Outside, Charlotte was already climbing. Down from her wagon, her city clothes somewhat rumpled from travel, but her smile bright and genuine. Clara had exchanged several letters with her sister-in-law over the winter, finding in her correspondence a warmth she'd never known she needed. "Clara!" Charlotte called, hurrying forward to embrace her. "The place looks wonderful. And is that a new garden plot I see? You must tell me everything." Behind them, Clara's father helped Margaret down from their wagon, both looking uncertain and out of place. The contrast between their stiff formality and Charlotte's easy warmth was striking. "Welcome to our home," Clara said, proud of how steady her voice remained. "Please, come inside. I've just taken a batch of mother's honey." "Cake from the oven?" Margaret's eyebrows rose at the mention of their mother's recipe, but she followed without comment. Inside, the kitchen told its own story. Clara's innovations harmoniously blended with Charlotte's preserved traditions. New copper pots hanging beside well-seasoned iron ones, fresh herbs drying next to carefully labeled preserves. "You've changed." "And things," her father said, looking around. "Yes," Clara replied simply. "Change can be good when it's done with respect for what came before." Charlotte, bless her, jumped in with easy conversation, asking about the bakery and sharing stories of her time running the ranch. Gradually, the tension began to ease. Over honey cake and coffee, walls built of years of misunderstanding began to crack. "I never understood," Margaret said suddenly, interrupting a discussion about the new preserving kitchen. "How you could just leave, choose this over everything we knew." Clara set down her coffee cup, considering her words carefully. "I didn't leave, Margaret. I found where I belonged. There's a difference." "But the bakery," her father started, "was your dream," Clara finished gently. "Just as this ranch was Wyatt's and now it's ours together. We're building something here, something that honors the past while growing toward the future." Charlotte nodded approvingly. "I worried when I left," she admitted. "Worried that all my work, all our family's history here would be lost. Instead, you've made it better, made it grow." Clara's father stood abruptly, moving to the window that overlooked the expanding garden. "Your mother," he said roughly, "always wanted a garden like that, said a proper home needed both beauty and sustenance." "I remember," Clara said softly. "She taught me that worth isn't just in how something looks, but in what it offers to others." He turned, his eyes suspiciously bright. "I didn't listen well enough, to her or to you." Margaret joined him at the window, her usual poise softened by something like wonder. "It's not what I imagined for you," she said, "but maybe I imagined too small." Wyatt, who had been quietly supportive throughout, opened the family Bible to a fresh page. "Perhaps," he suggested, "it's time to record some new beginnings." One by one, they added their marks to the page. Not just Clara and Wyatt's marriage now, but hopes for the future, plans for cooperation between ranch and bakery, promises to bridge the distances they'd created. As afternoons stretched toward evening, Clara watched her family begin to truly see her world. Charlotte and Margaret discussed preserving techniques, finding common ground in shared domestic arts. Her father and Wyatt talked business, the bakery's need for reliable flour meeting the ranch's new grain experiment. The Bible remained open on the table, its pages ready for more stories, more connections, more love expanding beyond the boundaries of what any of them had thought possible. Clara touched the worn leather cover, remembering her mother's words about how families, like gardens, needed both roots and room to grow. The wedding ring caught the morning light as Clara worked, its simple gold band now worn smooth with daily wear. 1 year. Sometimes it felt like a lifetime had passed since that desperate day at the Desert Rose Saloon. Other times it seemed only moments had slipped by since Wyatt had first offered her his mother's ring and a chance at a new life. "Penny for your thoughts," Charlotte said, looking up from where she was helping Clara sort through her hope chest. She'd extended her visit through the summer, caught up in the excitement of the ranch's expansion. "Just thinking about how much can change in a year," Clara replied, lifting out her old wedding dress. She'd packed it away the day after the wedding. Too raw then to look at its careful stitching, its pearls and promises. "Speaking of change," Charlotte reached into the chest and pulled out a small package wrapped in tissue paper. "Mother's dress. I brought it for you." Clara carefully unfolded the tissue. The dress inside was elegant in its simplicity, ivory silk that would shine like moonlight. "Charlotte, I couldn't—" "You can and you will," Charlotte interrupted, firmly. "Wyatt told me about planning to renew your vows at the Desert Rose. This time, you should have a proper dress for a proper celebration." The idea had been Wyatt's, mentioned casually one evening as they sat on the porch watching sunset paint the sky. "Not because the first time wasn't real," he'd said, but because now we can choose it with our whole hearts. A commotion from outside drew their attention. Through the window they could see Wyatt and Pete directing the construction of the new greenhouse. The glass panels had arrived yesterday, each one a promise of future growth. "He's different with you," Charlotte observed. "Happier, more willing to take chances. We make each other braver," Clara said softly. "Better." The sound of hammering paused as Wyatt looked up, catching Clara watching him. Even now, his smile could make her heart skip like that first day. He touched his hat brim in a gesture that was part playful, part genuine respect. "You know," Charlotte said, carefully refolding her mother's dress, "I came back partly because I was worried. A marriage of impulse, everyone said. It couldn't last." She smiled. "I've never been so happy to be proven wrong." Clara returned to sorting through the chest, finding items that marked the stages of their journey, the ledger where she'd first reorganized the ranch's books, dried flowers from her new garden, the blue ribbon from the harvest fair. "I don't know if I believe in fate," she said thoughtfully, "but I do believe in recognizing the right path when you see it, even if it's not the one you expected to take." "Speaking of paths," Charlotte grinned, "have you told him yet?" Clara's hand went instinctively to her middle, where the newest change was just beginning to show. "Tonight. I wanted to wait until we finished the greenhouse." "He'll be overjoyed," Charlotte assured her, "though I expect the hands will be taking bets on whether the baby inherits your baking skills or his way with cattle." "Maybe both," Clara laughed. "We're proof that unexpected combinations can work beautifully." They worked in comfortable silence, preparing for the anniversary celebration that would bring the whole town to the Desert Rose. Clara found herself touching items that held memories: the pearl-handled mirror, now restored, a piece of the china plate from their first argument, the scarf she'd knitted during their winter isolation. "I remember watching him that day," Charlotte said softly, "standing up in that saloon, defying everyone's expectations. I'd never seen him so sure of anything." "I was terrified," Clara admitted, "not of him, but of trusting happiness again. And now I know that real happiness isn't about trust. It's about building something together, day by day. The trust comes naturally when you're both working toward the same dream." Outside, Wyatt had climbed down from the greenhouse frame. He crossed the yard with the easy stride of a man comfortable in his world, pausing to check the new seedlings Clara had planted that morning. "He checks them 3 times a day," Charlotte observed, amused. "Your dreams have become his, too." Clara touched her wedding ring, thinking of the new life growing beneath her heart, of the greenhouse rising beam by beam, of the orchards they'd plant come spring. That's what real love is, isn't it? Not just sharing a life, but growing one together. She stood, Mother Mason's dress draped carefully over her arm. 1 year ago she'd sewn her own wedding dress, each stitch a hope she hadn't dared voice. Now she would wear this one, altered by her own skilled hands to fit her changing body, surrounded by family both born and chosen. "Come on," she said to Charlotte. "Help me try this on. We have a celebration to plan." Clara stood before the Desert Rose Saloon in Charlotte's altered wedding dress, ivory silk flowing gracefully over her slightly rounded belly. A year ago, she'd faced these same swinging doors with a broken heart and shattered dreams. Now she waited to enter with a heart full and whole, surrounded by those who had become her true family. "Ready?" Wyatt asked, offering his arm. He wore his best suit, the silver belt buckle from the cattle fair gleaming at his waist. "More than ready," she replied, taking his arm. They entered together this time, not as stranger and outcast, but as partners who had built something remarkable from an impulsive choice. The saloon had been transformed, much as they had been. Flowers from Clara's garden decorated every surface, their sweet scent mixing with the memory of that fateful day. Sam Turner stood ready with his Bible, its pages worn smooth with use. But before he could begin, Wyatt raised his hand. "If you'll permit me," he said, drawing a folded paper from his pocket. "I wrote something. It's not poetry." He smiled at Clara's knowing look. "But it's truth. The gathered crowd stilled, even Margaret leaning forward in anticipation. "A year ago, I made the best impulsive decision of my life," Wyatt began. "I saw a woman whose strength outshone her pain, whose dignity put shame to those who would judge. I offered partnership thinking I was being generous. Instead, I received the greatest gift a man could ask for, a true partner in every sense, a woman who makes me better by loving me, who dreams bigger than I ever dared." Clara felt tears threatening, but these were so different from the ones she'd shed in this room a year ago. "My turn," she said, her voice steady. "I came to this place thinking my life was over. Instead, it was just beginning. You saw me, really saw me, when I'd stopped seeing myself. You offered respect when I expected pity, partnership when I expected dependence. We've built something beautiful together, something that grows stronger every day." Her hand drifted to her middle, and she saw the moment Wyatt understood, his eyes widening with joy. "Really?" he whispered. She nodded, happy tears spilling over. New life, new beginnings. The congregation burst into cheers and congratulations, led by Charlotte's enthusiastic applause. Even Thomas Whitaker, standing at the back with his thin wife, managed a grudging smile. Sam raised his Bible, waiting for quiet. "A year ago, I married two strangers who took a chance on love. Today, I'm honored to bless a union that has proven that sometimes the best decisions are the ones the heart makes before the head can object." The ceremony that followed was brief but profound, made deeper by the truth of their feelings, the reality of their tested and proven love. When Sam pronounced them renewed in their vows, Wyatt's kiss tasted of promise and certainty. Later, as they celebrated with their community, Clara stood in the doorway of the Desert Rose, looking out at the setting sun. Wyatt joined her, his arms sliding naturally around her waist. "Thinking deep thoughts, Mrs. Mason?" "Happy ones," she replied, "about how endings can be beginnings, if you're brave enough to take the chance." From inside came the sounds of joy. Charlotte teaching Margaret to dance, Pete telling stories to eager listeners, her father deep in discussion with Sam about expanding the bakery's operations. "We should head back soon," Wyatt said softly. "The new seedlings need checking before dark." Clara smiled, thinking of their greenhouse filled with growing things, their expanding ranch, the child growing beneath her heart. "Our own little Eden," she mused, "built from the most unexpected beginning." "Not so unexpected," Wyatt corrected. "Some things are meant to be, even if they don't look like what we thought we wanted." They turned back to their celebration, to their family and friends, to the future they would continue building together. Through the window, the last light of day painted the sky in shades of promise, blessing a love that had grown from impulse to certainty, from chance to destiny.